So welcome. I'm Spencer Overton, and I'm the president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which was founded in 1970 and is America's Black think tank. To just start off, I want to thank Jessica Fulton, the vice president at the Joint Center, Victoria Johnson, and the entire Joint Center staff for working to make this event happen. Also want to thank our outstanding board, which is chaired by Barbara Johnson. I think Diane Penderhughes and Robert Rabin may be on today, and thanks to the entire board. I want to invite our guests here to use the chat box to let us know why they've joined the conversation today. Please stay on mute throughout the session. Toward the end, we'll open it up for questions. Just use the chat box to let us know if you have a question, and then we'll come to you in terms of the Q&A. Today's discussion is part of a series of video briefings on COVID policy in Black communities. In the past, we've talked about issues like the third stimulus, the digital divide, protecting Black workers and students, and voting rights with leaders like CBC Chair Karen Bass, FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks, House Education and Labor Chair Bobby Scott, and Fair Vote founder Stacey Abrams. The Joint Center also publishes a weekly update that rounds up all of the developments on COVID policy that affects Black communities. You can find all of that at jointcenter.org. It's constantly updated, right? Now, recent demonstrations, they've shown not just the issue of police brutality, but they've opened up our eyes to the marginalization of Black communities in various areas. And certainly the Joint Center is proud to support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but policing can't be the end of it. We have to address systems that prevent Black voters from full participation in democracy, and that's particularly complex in the context of COVID-19. This is such an important topic that this is our second webinar on voting. And also the Joint Center's Dr. LaShonda Brinson will soon be out with a report on Black communities and vote by mail. Now, our main speaker today is Congresswoman Marcia Fudge. She represents the 11th Congressional District of Ohio. Congresswoman Fudge is the chair of the Committee on House Administration Subcommittee on Elections, and she also introduced the Vote Safe Act to deal with the unique problems of voting in the context of COVID-19. She served as chair of the CBC when I first started at the Joint Center, and she was very supportive in our efforts to really, preserve and build the Joint Center. Last August, when I talked to Congresswoman Fudge, we were in Tunica, Mississippi. Right. She told me the Joint Center needed to do more work on voting rights, right? And of course, whenever you speak, I listen here. So Congresswoman Fudge, we'd love to hear from you in terms of some opening remarks, and then we'll bring in the rest of the panel and we'll have a discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Mr. President. I'm glad you gave me all of that. Yes, I do what she says. I don't believe any of that, but thank you anyway. Make me feel good about it. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you, especially with the Joint Center, to talk about voting and COVID and Black people and Black communities. Let me start out just by saying that most of us have known for a very long time that we had a pandemic of racism. So now what we have is a pandemic of racism on top of a pandemic of COVID-19. We all know that. I think maybe we didn't think about it that way, but we all knew that. Now the whole world, post George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, now the whole world is finally seeing what we've known for a very long time. And so this is a particularly important time, not just for Black people, but in this nation's history, to make some significant change. We understand the disparities we face as it relates to healthcare, as it relates to economic opportunity, education, social and criminal justice, and certainly jobs. People keep saying, well, Black people are getting sicker because they're not as healthy. But let me tell you why we are not as healthy. We're not as healthy because we don't have access to healthcare the way that most other people do. We work in jobs on the front line. We are your grocery store workers, your bus drivers, your service people in your hospitals. We are the people who are most confronted by this disease. In addition to which, we tend to live in communities that are more dense, so we don't have space to just move around and not touch people or see people. We tend to live with more people in our homes. It is a cultural issue as much as it is anything else. So don't let people make you think that because we are unhealthy, that we get more COVID. There are many factors to that, and it's not just that we don't take care of ourselves. So let me just say, don't let them put that on us. Let's look at the systemic racism, the institutional racism that has brought us to this point. Also, I think it's important that we understand where we are as it relates to the law in this country. We know that even with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, with the 24th Amendment, we have done everything we know how to do: voting rights, civil rights, and yet there is still a prevalence of voter suppression in this country. It didn't start today. It's not going to end today. It has been something that they have been doing for a very long time. But after the Shelby decision in 2013, Mr. President, it became fair game, whether it be a poll tax, which means you have to go and buy a certain type of ID if you don't have one. And in some states, the IDs they want, hundreds of thousands of Black people do not currently have. But you take a state like a Texas that will say, you cannot use your state-issued college ID, but you can use your hunting license. So what does that say to you? That means that they are directly focusing on the people they want to vote and the ones that they don't want to vote. So they really are making a concerted effort to keep us from voting. Now, I say to people when they say to me, well, it doesn't make a difference anyway. It absolutely makes a difference. Number one, you wouldn't have now 55 members of the Congressional Black Caucus sitting there, but for our ability to vote. And if we weren't there, people ask us all the time, well, what do you do? Sometimes it's not what we do, it's what we stop. Sometimes we stop them from making things more difficult. But in this instance, we have passed the legislation on the George Floyd Policing Act. In the CARES Act, we put in special emergency EBT. We put in almost $400 million to help with local elections. So we do many things that people don't know we do. But I will say this: if we don't find a way to encourage each other to go out and vote in this election, we will not recover in my lifetime. We hear about all of the crazy things this president says and does, but we never look at the policy that he is changing every day. And so we have to find a way to, as they say to us, stay home. We need to be able to vote from home. We need to have a myriad of various ways to vote, but we clearly need to be able to vote from home if we're going to be stuck at home. So I would say to people that it is very, very important for us to be engaged in this election. We have seen what has happened in Wisconsin and in Ohio and other places, and it is not going to get any better, especially when the President of the United States says that it's going to be fraudulent if we vote from home. Now, there's never been anyone that's been able to prove that there's fraud in our election system. It's just a talking point. But I will end with this, Mr. President. People never try to take from you something that has no value. And so we need to understand that our vote has value. And we have to make sure that we let our voices be heard. Is there a perfect candidate? Absolutely not. Is there a perfect bill? Absolutely not. But I would say, as we say all the time on the House floor, never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Engage yourself. And I would end with that, and thank you for letting me spend a little time talking about it today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing more in terms of during the discussion. We appreciate you framing that for us. We're going to bring in a couple of additional panelists to the discussion here. We have got Judd Choate, who is the Director of Elections in Colorado. And we also have my very good friend, Melanie Campbell. Melanie is the President and the CEO of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, and the Joint Center has a long history with Melanie's organization. Judd, let me start off with you. Just, you know, you're director of elections. As I understand it, Colorado has some significant experience with regard to vote by mail. Could you talk to us a little bit about some of the benefits and the drawbacks of mail-in voting that, you know, you've implemented in Colorado?
Sure. So first, thank you very much for the invite to be here. I'm pleased to join you, and always happy to talk about Colorado's elections, and this specific topic is one that I take very seriously. So Colorado's had full vote by mail since 2013. What that means is we send every active registered voter a ballot for all of our elections. So you don't have to sign up to get a ballot. You don't have to go someplace to get a ballot. We sign you up. We send you a ballot if you're an active registered voter. So in Colorado, that's about 3.5 million people. We have a population of 5.2 million people. Colorado has the highest percentage registered in the country of eligible population. And we typically have the highest, if not, you know, one of the 2 or 3 highest turnouts in the country based on our model. And we've had pretty great success driving people to the polls and using our system to drive up turnout. The way vote by mail works in Colorado is we send you a ballot 22 days prior to the election. So we send you a ballot on a Monday, 3 weeks prior to the election. You have until election night at 7 p.m. to return that ballot. It has to be in the hands of an election official. So we are what is called an in-hand state. We are not a postmark state. There are other states west of us, California, Washington State, Arizona, that are all postmark states. So those are states where you might not learn of the outcome of an election until a week after the election, maybe 2 weeks after the election if it's a very close race. In Colorado, we know we can post 70 to 75% of our returns on election night because we know that the ballots that the counties have at 7 p.m. are the ballots that could be counted in that election. So that's sort of the guardrails of the way our system works. You should know that some of the states that are sort of moving to vote by mail very quickly right now, that have been traditional polling place election states, are struggling, and we understand how that is. Colorado began with no excuse absentee in 1980. And then we became a permanent mail-in voter state where you could fill out a form online to say, I always want to get my ballot by mail in 2008. So we had a big head start on a lot of these states, which kind of puts us in a somewhat different position than others. But I'm happy to talk to you about how those other states can pivot to vote by mail.
And I would assume that some of that is logistical, right? But I would assume that there is a cost in terms of rolling this in as well, some money that's required. Is that right, Judd?
Yeah, that's true. So if you think about it, the different kinds of things you need for a polling place election as opposed to a vote by mail election. At a polling place election, you have a whole lot of places. And at those places, you need a lot of humans to run that polling place. And you need specialized equipment. So you need technology that fits a polling place model. If you're a vote by mail state like ours, the equipment we have is very different because we have central scanners as opposed to precinct level scanners. A precinct level scanner, the voter has a ballot, they fill that ballot out and they walk it over to the scanner and they feed it into the scanner. Well, that doesn't work in a vote by mail state. Otherwise, we would have somebody in a back room in a county sitting there feeding them in one by one. So we have central scanners, which are large scanners, which you put a big pile of ballots on, you press the button, and they all scan through. So the equipment is different, but that doesn't mean that you can't convert what you have in a polling place model to work in a vote by mail model. It's just that it requires some sophistication. It requires you to understand how you make that work and the lead time to and to make it successful.
Okay, good. So moving.
If I can, Mr. President, real quickly, we know that it's going to take money. There are some states that are so far behind in even thinking about doing something like letting people vote from home.
Mhm.
So in the HEROES Act, we requested $3.6 billion
Mhm.
to assist states with their security, as well as with new equipment, et cetera. That bill right now is sitting in the Senate, but there is $3.6 billion in it. In the CARES Act, we put $400 million in. That money has been dispersed.
Right.
So states have that money now, but it's just not enough.
So let's talk about that for a minute in terms of that money. So $3.6 billion that's needed in terms of states. So when you talk about these states, presumably some of them have been hit in terms of sales tax and tax revenues. And so they're having a hard time just meeting their basic expenses, not even talking about changing their infrastructure. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. I mean, and things that people don't even think about. You know, you almost need to give people hazard pay to work the polls these days.
Right.
In the age of COVID, all of the things that are going to be necessary to just keep a place safe and secure. When we look at all of the polling places that have been closed, how difficult it is going to be for people to find some place to vote. So you're going to have to educate the populace on where voting is happening, when it is happening. Some states make you go through 2 or 3 steps before you can vote from home. So you have to request an absentee ballot. So you send in your application, they send you back. I mean, it's a 3-step process. So, and if you're from Ohio, that was our problem on election night. We have all of these ballots that were sent either by mail or dropped off. We're feeding them physically into a machine. So if you get 30,000 of those on one day, you can imagine what it does to your process. So the money would be for new equipment, or at least to rent equipment, to do what he just suggested they do in Colorado, but they are very efficient at it because they've been doing it. But the biggest problem for us, and I'm going to stop with this, Black people don't like to vote from home.
Mm-hmm.
Black people prefer to vote in person. We don't trust the government. We don't trust the mail. And so we're going to have to do an awful lot of work to convince people that if you are required to stay home because of this emergency, this pandemic, this is how you do it.
Right. So part of it is like a public education piece in terms of this, but also, and I want to come, Melanie, I want to bring you in here in terms of, we say vote by mail is necessary, but why is it insufficient for voter participation in terms of Black communities? In other words, what do we need in terms of in-person voting? Why isn't vote by mail enough, Melanie? And what is it that we need in terms of in-person voting, in terms of ensuring that Black communities can fully participate? Melanie?
Well, first of all, thank you, Spencer, for your leadership, and thank you to my Sarah over there, and our leader from Ohio, Congresswoman Fudge, and Judd, and everybody. It's in this time of COVID, it's just good to get on the computer. I get tired of being on Zoom calls, but then I see faces. I'm like, I'm not alone. I'm not alone. So I want to thank you all. Some's already been said, you know, right? And I'm just gonna reiterate the reality. You know, I grew up in the South, and you know, you're right. We don't trust. You know, there's a lot of mistrust of when it comes to historically, Black folks have to fight for our vote, fight for our vote to be protected. And so there is a level of mistrust that is there, right? The other part of it, when you talk about the fact that there's funds needed, you have a Senate that's sitting in Senator McConnell's graveyard over there, right? So not doing what's necessary to move to make sure that everyone can vote. We've been living this nightmare, Congresswoman, pre-Shelby v. Holder. It's happened ever since President Obama got elected. There has been a move to suppress our vote. So here we are. The reality is we're going to have to do everything we can. We're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We're going to have to push to get our folks to understand this is a viable option, right? Two, some folks are still going to, because you're not going to have everything we need. It's July, right? And people really start voting, really get down to it, September in a way, right? Whenever your absentee ballot process begins. So I'm saying we starting to vote in the fall, right? It's not November, it's now. We have, but those places, the challenge of vote by mail, also rural communities, the infrastructure is not there. People have PO boxes, those kinds of things. But I think the trust factor is a big hurdle that we can't ignore. And so having trusted voices to try to educate, and what we're doing is to really get all of our organizations to really come together and start pushing out and encouraging folks to in July now, to really start knowing what the process is, to be able to get your applications in. And I know Congresswoman in Ohio, P.D. Talley, does all of our work through the Ohio Unity Coalition, just knowing through this last primary in Ohio, how you had to find some creative ways to get people to be able to drop off a box, and they created places, safe spaces and places for folks to be able to go pick up stuff and drop off stuff. We have to get really creative. Our churches are mostly virtual. People are getting used to it, so the messaging is important that we get people to start. So the timing of it is to get started now in encouraging folks to vote by mail where it's feasible. And then also recruiting poll workers, because we have that issue. I know it's not the question, but it's a part of the challenge, is that because most poll workers are more seniors, right? More seasoned, and seniors, they can't play that role. So we need a new, what I call next gen poll worker recruitment that has to start right now, so that where we do have polling places, it won't be the excuse that they can't open the precincts because they don't have enough workers. So there's like a domino effect. It's all connected to the process. So I'll stop there. Much that I could say, but hope that helps.
We'll come right back to you, President Campbell. Thank you very much. So Dr. Choate here, just quickly here, you have worked with just Democrats in Colorado, or Democrats and Republicans? How's that work?
Well, it's mostly been bipartisan. So
Okay.
the evolution of vote by mail has largely been agreed upon across parties. We did have a 2013 bill that made us a fully vote by mail state, which was passed by only Democratic members in the House and Senate of our Colorado Assembly, and signed by a Democratic governor. But that was kind of an accident of circumstance. That bill also had same-day registration in it. But in
terms of
were
you,
very opposed to that. They were very opposed to that part of it, but the vote by mail part, they were fine with.
So they were fine with the vote by mail part, and you have worked with both Democrats and Republicans, is that right?
Yeah, I've had two Democratic secretaries that I've worked for and 2 Republican secretaries. I have a Democrat right now, but the previous 8 years I was with 2 Republican secretaries.
Okay, so you've worked closely with and had bosses kind of in both parties here, right?
That's right.
So now there is this big discussion and debate about vote by mail in terms of fraud here, right? I'm hoping that you can, just again, based on facts and kind of what you've seen with regard to facts, if you could talk a little bit about that. And, there may even be some ways that vote by mail may reduce rather than increase voter fraud. But I want us to just take a moment and squarely address this issue with regard to fraud.
Sure. So vote by mail creates the possibility of fraud in one major way, and that is people that are registered in 2 different states. Because registered within my state, I'm probably going to be able to spot that you are registered twice, unless you have somehow managed to create 2 IDs, which make you, noticeably different, that you are 2 different people. So that most people don't do that, and you actually have to pretty much actively try to do that. And most people don't try to commit voter fraud. So that's we see very, very small numbers of cases of people getting registered multiple times, or people voting after they've died, which is always a relative typically that's voting on behalf of somebody. That's a very small instance. What we do see occasionally are people that are registered in another state, and then they get a mail ballot in our state and they get a mail ballot in the other state. They vote them both. And we find out about that about 6 months after the election when those states trade their voter lists. So we're in an organization called ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, which 31 states are in. And after each election, we trade the list of people who voted, and we compare those lists to see if we've got people who are registered in multiple jurisdictions who may have voted across those jurisdictions. In 2016, in trading those lists, we found about 30 people in Colorado. And then in 2018, we found about 50 people or 45 people.
And that's 50 out of how many voters?
Yeah, so in 2016, we had 2.8 million voters. And in 2018, we had 2.4 million voters. So we're talking about an infinitesimal number. All of those cases were turned over to our Attorney General, and the Attorney General is pursuing prosecution of those people. They're also being pursued in the other jurisdiction. So it might be that that vote fraud occurred in Colorado and in Oregon. So Oregon is pursuing them just like Colorado is pursuing them.
So,
but it's a very, very small percentage of people. And by the way, could I just point out that there's a different kind of vote fraud that happens at a polling place election, which is actually a much greater vote fraud. And that is that because states that have polling place elections typically do not have as clean of voter lists as a vote by mail election state does, because we're mailing to people all the time. So we know whether they live there or not, because otherwise the USPS would bounce our ballot. But in a polling place election state, they do far less list maintenance. And because of that, the people that they know where they're supposed to vote. They're supposed to vote at the corner of First and Main at the church that's right there on the corner. And so even when they move to 202 Elm Street and their voting place changes, they still go back to 101 Main Street and vote there. And that's a different kind of fraud. That fraud is you're voting the wrong ballot. So you may very well be voting on races where you're not eligible to vote on those races. And because styles are different across a jurisdiction. So that kind of vote fraud is not what's being discussed. I mean, the president's not bringing that kind of vote fraud up. He's talking about this other kind of sort of make-believe vote fraud. So there are ways to be fraudulent across all these different voting models. And there seems to be a lot of talk about vote by mail right now, but that's not the biggest area where you would see vote fraud.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. So not a significant issue here, and there are some tools in place to address it, kind of thing,
That's right.
to the extent that it is mine. So Congresswoman Fudge, let me come back to you in terms of, a number of folks are not in DC. They don't know what's happening exactly in terms of federal legislation to provide states funding. And just so that everybody knows, most folks already recognize this. Generally, states and localities administer elections rather than the federal government, right? And so they need resources on the state and local level in order to administer these elections. And so could you tell us a little bit about the possible path in the Senate, on the federal level, to provide more federal election funding resources to states for elections?
Be happy to. There are a couple of things happening right now. You mentioned in my introduction the Vote Safe Act, which myself and Whip Clyburn introduced to the House. It's being carried by Kamala Harris on the Senate side, which would address a lot of these issues in terms of the emergency in which we find ourselves. So it would deal with all early voting. It would deal with how we make sure that people can vote safely from home and or in person. So it's a bill that I think people need to take a look at. It's called the Vote Safe Act. But in the heroes, when I talked about us asking for $3.6 billion, right now it is sitting with Mitch McConnell, as my colleague said. What we are hopeful, though, is that they want to pull some things out of this bill and pass it. They've already pulled PPP out. They're going to pull some other pieces out too. The president just yesterday or the day before said, I want to give more money to people. He wants to do whatever he can to make sure he can get reelected. So he's going to go back so he can send some more checks with his name on it. So the more they just try to pull out, at some point, I think that we then take a stand and say, if you want A, we want B. B is the money for elections. So I think it's becoming, they're negotiating this bill right now. We don't know what's going to happen with it at this point, but I feel confident that something is going to happen as it relates to funding these elections. Because when you have a Tom Ridge, the former Republican Secretary of Homeland, come out and say, you know, Mr. President, this whole fraud thing about voting by mail is ridiculous. You've got secretaries of state who want the resources because they know what happened in their primaries. So he has a lot of forces working against him as well. Now, McConnell certainly doesn't want to do it, but we do believe in the negotiations that it is possible to get something done between the Vote Safe Act and or pulling out resources from the HEROES Act.
And just to understand what we're talking about here from a number standpoint, you know, for me as an individual, $4 billion sounds like a lot of money. But if you compare this to the CARES Act, which was about $2 trillion, so we're talking about, you know, say 4 billion, and it's a lot more money just in terms of the whole pie. It's a really small percentage of the big pie just to preserve elections in terms of 4 billion compared to 2 trillion, right?
Right, but the other thing is, we just believe that our entire democracy is at stake.
Mm-hmm.
It is worth spending the money.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whatever it costs, it is worth
Mm-hmm.
doing because our democracy is on the line right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if people really start to look at what has been happening behind the scenes, they will realize that this is an election that none of us can sit out.
Mm-hmm.
We just cannot sit this election out.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's what it costs to get everybody on board, then that's what we need to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Melanie, Campbell, so when we talk about just what you're hearing on the ground in terms of, you know, what is it that we need to facilitate a high Black voter turnout in November? You know, what are you hearing from communities about, you know, are they thinking about going out and voting? Are they thinking about vote by mail? Are they thinking about the polls? Are they nervous about the virus? What are you hearing from in Black communities, and how do we ensure a high Black voter turnout?
Thank you. Well, besides the fact that Black women want to see a Black woman on the ticket, you know I was gonna get that in there. I was just, I'm being light but serious, right? About that, you know, being able to see ourselves on the ticket, really important. We already know in this conversation, vote by mail. Early voting has helped over the years to really increase voter turnout. So really being able to get folks to vote early as possible, wherever that is available. And mentioned in my earlier comments about the importance of being able to make sure these polling places are open. The things that we saw happen in Georgia recently in their primary had a lot to do with, you know, machines and not folks not knowing how to use equipment. There's a lot that goes with that, and being able to deal with the voter suppression that's digital now, right? We know from 2016 how African Americans were the primary target when it came to misinformation, disinformation, and one of the things that keeps me up at night is the reality that that's still happening on social media, and how are we going to have some level of offense? I believe trusted voices matter, and that those kinds of things that give people ammunition to know how to pay attention to what's being said, where you're getting your information from, is something that we need really a major digital push to really start pushing the kind of trusted voices, trusted messages, how to protect how to inoculate yourself from being suppressed starts now, because those things are still going to be, I just saw right before this call where the NAACP and Color Change, you know, met with Zuckerberg with Facebook and I think Sandberg, I believe, and they're still not moving on doing the things that they need to do. so the digital space matters, as well as a space that, hit a fore prior to 2016. That wasn't something we had to have as a part of our organizing strategy, but we have to, because for the last 4 years, nothing has, been corrected in any major way. And so we have to, and that's something that concerns me about how it will impact turnout, especially amongst younger voters who really do get a lot of their information digitally, and being able to make sure that they have peer-to-peer, peer influencers and everything. We got to throw it all out there, because we do have a tsunami of challenges that we're faced with as it comes to this election. But I think the motivation is there just because of what we're all living through. We lived through 4 years of this, nonpartisanly speaking, because I can't get into that in my day job, but just people have been just hit from so many angles, and we're dealing with Corona and so many other kinds of challenges that are, and that is not going to go away between now and November. Based on the lack of leadership from the top. I can't say that. That's just a fact, right? And that reality. But I'm a glass half full sister, so I know we're going to do what we need to do. I don't think there's any lack of motivation, but people need to know that, one, that their votes are going to count. Two, that they see themselves on these tickets are very important, not just the president, but across the board. That it does matter. Lived experience matters, right? And in this Black Lives Matter movement, that we're all of these elements are impacting this election. So people are really paying attention to who down ballot, who's coming, who's in the House, who's in the Senate, And so I think we just have to make sure that in going to vote, whether it be virtually through the mail or going to a polling place, that vote gets counted, and that's critical.
Mr. President, can I just say this one thing too?
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
All of these people who have been marching day after day after day, know that you have pushed us to be able to pass the George Floyd Policing Act. Don't stop there. You have so much power. Mm-hmm. Use that power. We've got a whole Congress right now that's afraid of what's coming next. But it is you who has put us in the position. So use your power. And the next step is voting, no matter what they throw in front of us. We have to vote no matter what.
So based on that, let me just follow up, and Dr. Choate, then I'll come right back to you. Sure. What is it that people can do to ensure that federal government provides adequate support for voting? What can average folks do who are in different states and leading different organizations across the country? Congresswoman Fudge, what is it that they need to do right now?
Well, the first thing they need to do is contact their representative, whoever that is. You have to let them know that you care about it. It's one thing to talk about it at home and be upset about it, but when you call your senator or when you call your congressperson, they believe at least 50 people think the same way you do. So when they get lots of calls, they become concerned. And it's especially important that because we are in an election year, people want to do whatever they can to get their constituents off their back. And so if you fight with them, they will pay attention. That's number one. Number two, I think you have to educate yourself on what the rules are. Now, we produced a report called the Reporting Voting Rights and Election Administration in America, where we went all over the country. Now, if Native Americans who live on reservations without water can vote, certainly we can vote. If people who can barely walk can go out and vote, certainly the rest of us can go out and vote. But we need to make sure that our local elected officials and our federal elected officials know what we are thinking and what we want them to do. Because states do control a lot of what happens in elections. So make sure that you contact both of us. We elect them all. Let's hold everybody accountable.
And what's your response to those people who say, oh, my vote doesn't matter, or they don't really care, nothing ever changes, etc.? You've heard that before.
I've heard it too many times. But I do say to them this: they can just look at what is happening in this country today and know that somebody's vote mattered. Because right now we have an administration that really does not care about all of the people of this country. When you are a leader, you represent everyone. And it is clear that we don't have that today. It is also clear that whenever you decide that you are going to take shots at Black people and poor people, it makes a difference, because if I were sitting there, I wouldn't let that happen. So you have to make sure that there are more people like me and less people like them. The other thing is, if you don't vote, you might as well have voted for the other person, because your no vote really does matter. And it means that the other person has a vote that they shouldn't have had. But thirdly, and most importantly, that is the only time in the history of this country that every single one of us is equal, the same. Why would you not want your voice to be heard? Because to me, not voting is selfish. You may not think it helps you, but I have a mother who is on Medicare. I wanted to get it. I have nieces and nephews who are still in school, and some of their schools are not the best. I want to be sure that we put money into education funding. I have family members who are sick, who need their health care. Maybe it doesn't help you, but all those other people rely on the government. We have a role. And if you've decided that you don't care about any of those other people, I don't know what kind of person you are, but you have to care about somebody other than yourself.
Thank you very much. Judd, you were going to mention something, and after we hear from Judd, we're really going to open it up. If there are any questions, please let us know. If you have a question, we'll come over to you. Please put it in chat, and we'll also turn it over to you to hear from you. Judd, one thing, what were you going to say? And I think another question generally I had for you was that, if you had a few months before an election in this context, and you were a traditional state, meaning you pretty much voted in person in kind of local precincts normally, et cetera, what is it that you would do with this kind of finite amount of time to ensure that the maximum number of people could vote in a safe way?
Yeah, so the point that I wanted to make was on the Congresswoman mentioned that we received $400 million in CARES Act funding. So for Colorado, that's $6.7 million. And obviously $6.7 million, we can really do good work with that. In fact, we did what we're calling a hero's bonus, an additional $3 per hour for all of our election judges for all the time that they are working, frankly, in very hazardous conditions. So that money is really important. But here's a little trick about that money, which a lot of people don't know, which is that that law requires a 20% match by the state. And that 20% match has to be used, not just appropriated, but used by November 3rd. So that means that even all these states that have no legislature that's in session and haven't had a legislature in session since the CARES Act was approved and signed by the president, have no access to money. They can't get the money to make that 20% match. So there are a number of states in the US who are not accepting those funds because they have no way to get the match. And if they were to accept those funds and then spend them, they would be on the hook for all of those funds because they haven't produced their 20%, which they're required to by the federal law. So that 400 million looks like it's really useful, and it is useful for us because we were able to figure out how to create the match. But for a lot of states, they can't even get the match. So they can't even use that $400 million.
And I would imagine also a lot of those other states need to make structural changes to deal with COVID that you don't necessarily need to make because you have so many vote centers and also you have so many people who participate in terms of by mail.
We are basically living other states' contingency plan. I mean, we are other states' contingency plan. So they're all trying to pivot from one thing to another, and we're already there. And so for us, it's not nearly as needed as it is for these other states. But there are big states out there that are rejecting the money because they just simply cannot find the match.
Well, Judd, let me just say this. Some of them, not because they can't, because they choose.
Well, that's probably true too. That's probably true too. There's probably some other motivations as well. But then let me answer your question. So if I was the elections director for a state that is a much more traditional polling place state, and I look at the calendar right now, and I've basically got 3 months before my ballots need to go out. Is it possible for me to shift from a polling place model to a vote by mail model? Yes, it is. First of all, vote by mail is a pretty easy process. We don't need nearly as many people because we're not manning a whole bunch of polling places. And we don't need nearly as many places, so I don't need to create contracts with churches and schools to be able to set up these polling places on every other corner, because all I need my ballots to come back to one central location. So converting from polling place to vote by mail is actually much easier than going from vote by mail to polling place. If you made me go to polling place right now, I would be tearing what little hair I have left out, because there's no way I would be able to do that. But they can go to our way. Is it going to be perfect? No, it's going to be messy. There's going to be all sorts of problems, little things little errors, problems with with the post office, problems with the printer, all sorts of kinds of things that we worked out the last 10 years that they would be working out for the first time. So sure, there will be lots of problems, but you know what? It's better than forcing your voters to go to a polling place during a pandemic. And it's better than basically disenfranchising somebody who's sick. Because if you have COVID and you're in a polling place state, you basically can't vote. So I believe personally that the states that are in a polling place model right now should be doing everything they can to try to convert to a vote by mail, at least absentee option state, just as soon as they can. And we're here to help. We've been helping dozens of states. I'm on the phone basically every day with my colleagues in other states, helping them, trying to give them advice on as to how to do it. But can it be done? Absolutely. Will it be perfect? No, but it'll be better than nothing.
And you know, Stacey Abrams put this in a really interesting way, where this is about kind of margins and numbers. So if you can move, you know, half of your voters to mail, and then you can move 30 or 35% of your voters to early vote, right? Then on election day, you've got 15% of your voters, and it's easier to have kind of a safe, socially distanced system here, right?
That's exactly right.
Which made a lot of sense. So we've got a question here, and I'll tee up the question for our panelists to respond. And you know, anyone else should go ahead and put any other questions in the chat. President Campbell referenced the need for a next generation poll worker recruitment effort. Do any of the speakers have recommendations or ideas about what would that include in terms of a recruitment effort for the next generation of poll workers?
Go ahead, Judd. I'll come.
Well, so one issue that is created some pretty significant problems in Georgia. I know my colleagues in Kentucky really struggled with polling place workers. In Colorado, we call them election judges, but they're basically all serving that same role. They're members of the public who are dedicating time to work at the polls. The problem that we've got right now is a lot of those poll workers are on the older side. They tend not to be as technologically sophisticated. And those are two things that you need if you're going to try to make a pretty significant change in your voting model. And you're trying to drive up early voting. Because early voting, you really do need to have technological savvy, just like you need it in a vote by mail jurisdiction as well. So what we've done is we've created a statewide election judge recruiting program that we have put out. We've done a lot of advertising on it. We've received hundreds of people who have signed up to be election judges. And we had an election 8 days ago, and we were able to find and recruit a lot of new and younger judges who could serve in the roles that traditionally have been occupied by somewhat older Coloradans. And that's been very successful. I know other states have tried to do that as well, but that's one of the reasons why Milwaukee had so few polling places, why Atlanta had so few polling places, why Louisville had one polling place. Even though the Louisville situation actually worked out okay, in these other jurisdictions, they did have struggles because of the limited polling places. So if you're going to emphasize early voting, then you've got to figure out where you're going to get those judges. If you're going to stay at the polling place model, then you've really got to find judges. I mean, you've got to find tens of thousands of people, and you're basically going to lose a lot of those people because they're scared to come and do that work, justifiably scared to come and do that work. And so you've got to be really proactive. And I'm worried about my states, my colleagues in other states, where they're not shifting to vote by mail, at least not very aggressively, while simultaneously they're losing a lot of their election judges. That's the sort of recipe for disaster in November.
Mel, did you want to add to that?
Just that's for us. It's one of our priorities this year in a much more aggressive way, and to really get our organizations to work together to make sure. Because the other part of having poll workers is also you want people from the community. You want people who are you don't want folks from other parts of town sometimes can be a problem. People, so just being able to make sure there's some cultural competency as it relates to poll workers, I think is really important as well. So that's a priority for us. And so that's what we're going to be really pushing aggressively from a national perspective, but as well as working in the states.
So one quick thing to add to that is that if you have a very strict unemployment insurance law in your state, it will limit your ability to recruit those who are unemployed right now because of COVID to be your election judges, because getting that little shot of money associated with working for 2 weeks for early voting will drive them out of the category to get the full benefit of their unemployment insurance. So what you need to be doing is talking to your state legislators or governor's office and asking for an executive order from the governor or a change in state law or a change at the department level so that they will allow people to allow for judges to be exempt from the unemployment criteria that would take away their unemployment insurance. That's a very important thing. We did that in Colorado a couple of weeks ago, and it will really help us in November.
Do they allow a judge? I'm sorry, I'm have to ask a follow-up question to him.
Go ahead.
Do you all allow high school students?
We do. We allow, we call it
Which
our students.
Get around
program.
it that way.
That's great. That's right. And that's a great resource because, again, very technologically savvy. And what a great way to get people involved in elections, to get them involved as a high school student.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I've got a kind of two related questions. And Mel and Judd, I'll ask you to kind of quickly respond to them. And then Congresswoman Fudge, you're going to kind of close this out in terms of some closing remarks. I'm also hopeful, Congresswoman Fudge, that you can respond to these questions as well when you do your closing remarks here. So the two related questions. One concern among young people is that our vote doesn't matter because of the influence of the Electoral College. Especially after understanding Trump did not win the popular vote, you know, how would you debunk this and what would you tell young people who think this way? So that's one question. And the related question is, what percentage of the American populace does not participate in the voting process? It's an empirical question here that, you know, if you don't have it on the top of your head, it's Googleable. And I may be able to pull that up. So Judd, Melanie, and then Congresswoman Fudge will go to you to close this out.
I'll throw in a quick comment on those two and then hand it over to you guys. So the Electoral College, we're stuck with that. I mean, there's really nothing that we can do about it right now. It could be changed constitutionally, but there's otherwise, it's just something we have to live with. You might have noticed that the Supreme Court did unanimously reject the faithless elector idea. Colorado had a case, Washington State had a case. We were both up at the Supreme Court, and we got that ruling on Monday. So that was good. We were pleased with that ruling. So they electors at least have to adhere to what the state voted for. It's not a federal mandate, so it doesn't go with who won the population for the United States, but at least it sticks with what the state did. They can't just go off and do whatever they want to. In terms of turnout, so maybe I'm crazy, but I believe, I look around and I sort of see the energy that's in this room, but then also in among all of Coloradans and those around the country. I see a very high turnout coming in this general election. And no state in the history of the United States has ever gotten to 80% turnout among eligible population. These are not registered voters. These are not actively registered voters. These are eligible voters. So these are people who could register, could vote if they wanted to. No state's ever gotten to that number. We've gotten close. We were at 72% in 2016 and 71% in 2012. Minnesota's gotten the closest. They were 76% in 2008. So so there's reason to believe that we can drive to that number. I believe that one of these states, Minnesota or Colorado, maybe a third, but probably one of us, will get to 80% of eligible turnout in the 2020 election, which would be a remarkable achievement. And there is a fiction out there, which you should not buy into, that turnout is going down or flat. That is simply not true. Turnout has been increasing since the 1980s and pretty consistently. And we dipped a little bit in 2016, but overall, across all of our elections, we're seeing increases in turnout. And it's mostly because people are doing a better job of being registered. We're getting easier access to ballots, more early voting, more vote by mail. And I anticipate that this upcoming election will be a real celebration of that.
So we're gonna hold you to that, Judd.
Come back and talk to me.
Quickly, I know getting close to the, so he's already laid out. I would like to, I don't have the numbers in front of me and I apologize, and so my mind's blinking, but I do know this, that in 2018, young people overperformed, if you will, in a midterm election that had not happened in forever. So I know young people are tuned in. They showed up in many places in 2018, and I don't think they're going to not show up in 2020. I know for Black women, I know I just can't even begin to even imagine that we're not going to turn out. It does matter about again about what this ticket looks like, and I will say that again. But I think I agree. I think there's too much going on that people can connect back to voting that we won't have the turnout. The question becomes, will those votes get counted? Will we be able to protect those votes to make sure that people are able to not be turned away? I think folks are going to show up, whether it be through mail or through, say, vote like your life depended on it is where we are, because it does in too many ways. And the coronavirus, one of the things I know I didn't get a chance to talk about is that is a concern, but people are, even in the primaries, finding ways to, and we have to do all we can, all of us, all of our organizations and all of our leaders, to make sure that folks can not just feel safe, but be safe in voting, so that it doesn't have to be a death sentence to show up, polls, and vote.
Thanks so much, Mel. Congresswoman?
Let me just say very, very briefly, when we vote, we win. If you look at the data, and I'm a very data-driven person, if you look at the data, in 2016, the election was determined by about 40,000 votes. And in the communities where we should have voted in large numbers, you take Wisconsin, we did not, and I'm talking about Black people, we did not. We left tens of thousands of votes on the table because we didn't vote. So Wisconsin was won by less than 10,000 votes, or right around 10,000. Don't quote me exactly, but I'm pretty close. The same thing happened in Michigan. We lost Michigan by about 10, 12,000 votes. But in the city of Detroit alone, even the Black people that voted said, I don't like either one of these presidential candidates. I'm not voting for either one. So they didn't vote for the top of the ticket. Had we voted, we would have won. The same thing happened in Philadelphia. Then you go to Florida, where you had a third party candidate. And so we were upset with everybody in the world. So we do a protest vote. If we vote, we will win. The numbers prove it. That doesn't have anything to do with the Electoral College. We would have won those states outright, and we would have won the Electoral College. But we didn't take it seriously enough to go and do what we know we need to do. Black people of all people know that without the vote, we could be back where we were in the 60s. We are a more segregated country than we have been in the last 50 or 60 years. Our schools are more segregated. We are going backwards. We need to do what we know we need to do to make a difference, and that is voting. And if we vote, we don't have to worry about the Electoral College because we are going to win.
Thank you very, very much. And just Dr. Choate and Melanie Campbell, thanks for your expertise and your unique perspectives. Congresswoman Fudge, thank you for your consistent leadership. And you know, at the Joint Center, we want to continue to add value. So please keep giving me my marching orders. I need it in terms of direction here. Thank you very much. And everyone, thanks for joining us today. Please direct your friends to jointcenter.org. This video will be posted there and you can share it with your friends, and please spread it wide. And also tune in for, you know, additional discussions, policy discussions on Black communities and COVID policy. Thank you all so much for joining us.